In the quiet town of Cedar Ridge, a story of extraordinary courage is about to unfold. Behind the weathered doors of a small chapel, Reverend Thomas Hawkins delivers his Sunday sermon with the same gentle demeanor he's shown for 15 years. His congregation sees a man of peace, a shepherd guiding his flock with scripture and compassion. They have no idea they're listening to the most legendary marksman in U.S. cavalry history. Known only in whispered stories as Ghost Eye, he was a soldier whose accuracy became myth, whose shots seemed guided by divine intervention itself. But that was another life, before he found his calling in the Word of God. Now, as 5 of the most dangerous prisoners ever to break out of Black Rock Penitentiary make their way toward his peaceful town, Reverend Hawkins will face a test of faith that will shake his very foundation. When these ruthless men threaten his congregation, they'll learn the hard way that sometimes the deadliest force comes wrapped in the gentlest soul. This is the story of how a man of peace was forced to resurrect the legend they called Ghost Eye. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sunday mornings in Cedar Ridge began with the gentle tolling of church bells, their bronze melody echoing through streets lined with maple trees older than the town itself. Reverend Thomas Hawkins stood at his chapel door, greeting his congregation with the same warm smile that had earned him their trust over 15 years of faithful service. At 55, his face carried the weathered kindness of a man who'd seen both beauty and darkness in this world, choosing always to focus on the light. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair as he shook hands with the Miller family, asking about their youngest daughter's recovery from flu. His eyes, a striking pale blue that sometimes seemed to look straight through to your soul, crinkled with genuine concern. These were his people, his flock, and their worries were his worries. Inside, the modest chapel, morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across well-worn pews. Every Sunday, Hawkins polished the wooden cross behind the pulpit himself, a meditation that brought him peace. His hands, though gentle now in their work, bore calluses that spoke of a different life, one he'd left behind long ago. "Reverend," Mrs. Thompson called out, her voice carrying the weight of fresh concern. "Heard anything more about those escapees from Black Rock? My Henry says they're headed this way." The elderly woman clutched her worn Bible tighter, seeking reassurance from her spiritual leader. Hawkins placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his voice steady and calming. "The Lord watches over us all, Martha. Fear serves no purpose but to cloud our judgment and darken our hearts." Yet even as he spoke these words of comfort, his keen eyes swept the chapel's entrance, an old habit he'd never quite shaken. The congregation settled into their seats as Hawkins took his place at the pulpit. His sermon today was about redemption, about second chances, though none of his flock realized how intimately he understood these themes. As he spoke of divine forgiveness, his right hand unconsciously traced a path along his left arm, where beneath his pressed white shirt lay a scatter of scars from another time, another life. Sheriff Wilson sat in his usual spot near the back, his radio silent but close at hand. The lawman knew something of Hawkins' past, enough to respect the quiet strength behind the gentle demeanor. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Both men had seen enough of the world to know that peace was precious, and sometimes came at a considerable price. The morning's hymns filled the chapel with their ancient melody, Hawkins' deep voice joining his congregation in praise. These moments were what he lived for now, the simple joy of community, of shared faith and peaceful purpose. Yet even as he led them in song, part of him remained alert, aware. Old instincts didn't die, they just learned to sleep lighter. After The service, as families gathered on the chapel steps to share weekly news, young Tommy Parker practiced his aim with a stick, playing at being a soldier. Hawkins watched the boy with a mixture of amusement and something deeper, remembering another young man who'd once been able to split a playing card at 50 paces. He'd put away that gift, wrapped it in scripture, and sealed it with prayer. But he hadn't forgotten. Some skills, like some sins, left permanent marks on the soul. "Quite a sermon today, Reverend," Deputy Sarah Chen commented, lingering after the crowds had dispersed. "Especially that part about being ready when trials come." Her sharp eyes studied him carefully. As the newest member of Cedar Ridge's small police force, she had a keen interest in the town's history and its mysteries. Hawkins smiled, beginning his weekly ritual of straightening the hymnals. "The Lord's wisdom often proves most valuable in unexpected moments, Deputy." He paused, watching a dust cloud rise on the distant highway. "Though sometimes the trials themselves are exactly what we expect them to be." The sun climbed higher. Over Cedar Ridge, another peaceful Sunday drawing to a close. But in the distance, 5 dangerous men were making their way toward this quiet town, their violent intentions about to collide with a past that refused to stay buried. Thomas Hawkins had built a life of peace, but he hadn't forgotten how to protect it. Sometimes, he reflected, the gentlest shepherd must also be the most vigilant guardian of his flock. Night fell over Cedar Ridge as Thomas Hawkins sat alone in his study, the weight of coming events pressing heavy on his mind. His fingers traced the worn edges of an old wooden box hidden beneath decades of sermon notes. Inside lay memories he'd tried to leave behind, a past wrapped in oiled cloth and the faint scent of gunpowder. 25 years ago, they didn't call him Reverend. Back then, he was Lieutenant Thomas Ghost Eye Hawkins of the 7th Cavalry, a man whose reputation had been built on impossible shots and saved lives. The box creaked open, revealing a weathered medal of valor that caught the lamplight. His mind drifted back to the mission that earned him his legendary call sign. It was dawn in the Hindu Kush, 1998. 3 American aid workers held hostage by militants in a mountain fortress deemed impenetrable. The brass said it would take a full assault team, likely with casualties. But Hawkins had seen something others missed, a single-shot opportunity that came once every dawn, when the sun's angle created a perfect line through 3 separate openings in the ancient stone. Impossible, they'd said. Even if you could make that shot, the bullet would have to curve with the wind through 3 different temperature zones. Hawkins hadn't argued. He'd simply taken position 2 miles out, waited for that precious moment when dawn painted the mountains gold, and let his faith guide the shot. 1 bullet, 3 hostage-takers down. The ricocheted round had seemed to bend like divine intervention itself. The headlines called it the miracle shot. The brass classified the true story, but whispers spread. Ghost Eye, they said, could shoot around corners, could hit targets he couldn't even see, could read the wind like it was speaking to him personally. His hands moved deeper into the box, finding the small brass compass that had belonged to his mentor, Sergeant Major Richardson. "Son," Richardson had told him, "God gave you this gift for a reason. Question is, what reason will you choose?" That question had haunted him through 4 tours, through countless missions where his skills had meant the difference between life and death. Every perfect shot, every life taken, even in the service of saving others, had left its mark on his soul. The turning point came during his last mission, a hostage situation gone wrong, children involved. His shot had been perfect, as always, clean, necessary, justified. But that night, as he cleaned his rifle, he'd felt the weight of every trigger pull, every life he'd been forced to take. He knelt in prayer until dawn, seeking answers. The call to ministry hadn't come like a thunderbolt. It had crept in slowly, like morning light through stained glass. He'd found his new purpose not in taking life, but in saving souls. His sniper's patience transformed into pastoral perseverance. His tactical awareness became spiritual vigilance. Noise outside his study window brought him back to the present. Deputy Chen's patrol car passed slowly, its spotlight sweeping the quiet streets. The escapees from Black Rock would be here soon. The whole town could feel it coming, like the pressure before a storm. Hawkins' fingers found one last item in the box, a single match-grade round, pristine despite its age. He'd kept it as a reminder of his last shot, a symbol of a life he'd chosen to leave behind. Now, as threats gathered on the horizon, that old life seemed to be reaching out to him again. He closed the box carefully, returning it to its hiding place. Tomorrow he would lead his congregation in prayers for peace, even as his mind calculated ranges, wind patterns, and lines of sight around the chapel. 25 years of peaceful service had transformed him, but they hadn't erased what he was capable of. Lord, he whispered into the darkness, I'm a shepherd now, not a soldier, but if the wolves come for my flock. He left the prayer unfinished, knowing that sometimes the answer to prayer came not in words, but in the steady hands and clear vision God had blessed him with long ago. In the distance, a police siren wailed briefly and fell silent. Somewhere, out there, 5 violent men were moving closer to Cedar Ridge, unaware they were approaching not just a peaceful preacher, but a legend they'd only heard whispered around campfires and prison yards. Ghost Eye was about to step back into the light. Black Rock Penitentiary stood like a steel and concrete fortress against the desert sky, its walls containing the worst criminals in 5 states. But on a moonless night, those walls were breached in a breakout that would send shockwaves through the entire region. The prison alarm's wail cut through the darkness as guards scrambled to respond. In the chaos, 5 of the most dangerous inmates had vanished like smoke. Warden Mitchell stared at their files spread across his desk, his face illuminated by emergency lights as he briefed the response team. These aren't your typical runners, he warned, laying out their photos. These men are something else entirely. His finger tapped the first image. Victor Kane, former Special Forces turned mercenary. 6 kills during his escape alone, each one calculated and precise. Next came the Martinez brothers, Carlos and Miguel, cartel enforcers whose brutality had become cartel legend. They'd once burned down an entire village just to get one target. Samuel the Surgeon Cooper's photo showed a deceptively ordinary face. His medical expertise had been used not to heal, but to extract information, keeping victims alive for days. The last photo revealed their leader, James "Ghost" Walker, a man whose prison influence had spread through the system like a virus. He'd orchestrated riots in 3 facilities without ever leaving his cell. They're well-funded, the warden continued, pointing to security footage. This wasn't improvised. Those explosives were military-grade. They've got outside help, weapons, supplies. The footage showed them moving with tactical precision, working as a unit. These weren't just escapees. They were an elite strike force, with nothing to lose. Deputy Chen's voice crackled over the radio in Cedar Ridge's sheriff station. Confirmed sighting at the Millbrook gas station. They've got heavy weapons, Sheriff. Military stuff. Sheriff Wilson's face grew grim as he studied the map. Cedar Ridge lay directly in their path, a perfect place to resupply and take hostages if needed. The escapees had already left a trail of violence. 2 dead state troopers, a family terrorized for their vehicle, a small-town police station raided for weapons and body armor. They weren't just running, they were gearing up for something bigger. They're headed straight for us, Wilson muttered, his eyes tracking their movement pattern. But why Cedar Ridge? The answer lay in the town's perfect storm of vulnerability. Small police force, remote location, multiple escape routes into the mountains. What they didn't know was that Cedar Ridge had something no other town did, a shepherd who knew exactly how wolves thought. In their stolen SUV, Ghost Walker studied a tablet showing police movements. His team had picked Cedar Ridge carefully. Small town, soft target, he explained to his crew. We hold up there for 48 hours while our transport gets in position. Anyone gives us trouble, we make examples of them. Kane cleaned his rifle with military precision. That chapel on the hill gives us good sight lines, could work as a defensive position. The Martinez brothers exchanged cold smiles, remembering other churches they'd turned into fortresses. What none of them knew was that their chosen sanctuary was about to become their greatest mistake. The chapel they saw as a tactical advantage was under the protection of a man who'd once made impossible shots look easy. A man who'd traded his scope for a Bible, but had never lost the skills that made him a legend. Back in Cedar Ridge, Reverend Hawkins felt the change in the wind as evening approached. His morning prayers were interrupted by the distant sound of helicopters, search patrols sweeping the area. God's plan worked in mysterious ways, he reflected. He'd spent years asking for the strength to maintain peace. Now it seemed God was testing whether he remembered how to wage war. The sun began to set over Cedar Ridge, painting the chapel windows blood red. 5 violent men were about to learn the hard way that sometimes the deadliest force comes not from strength of arms, but from the quiet conviction of a man who's found something worth protecting at all costs. The first hint of trouble came during Wednesday evening prayer service. Reverend Hawkins stood at his pulpit, leading a small gathering in hymns, when the chapel door creaked open. His words didn't falter, but his trained eye caught every detail of the men who entered, their military stance, the subtle bulge of concealed weapons, the way they spread out using standard tactical formation. Victor Kane led the group, playing the role of weary traveler. But Hawkins recognized the predator's grace in his movement, the way his eyes immediately mapped every exit. Behind him, the Martinez brothers positioned themselves near the side doors, while Cooper and Walker took seats that gave them clear lines of sight to every corner of the chapel. "Please join us," Hawkins invited, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he'd used for 15 years. "We welcome all who seek sanctuary." His choice of words was deliberate, letting them know he understood exactly what they were seeking, while giving them a chance to avoid bloodshed. Walker studied the preacher, noticing how the older man's calm seemed to affect his nervous congregation. "Kind of you, Reverend. We've been traveling far." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Hoping to rest here a while, Mrs. Thompson clutched her hymnal tighter, recognition dawning in her eyes. She'd seen their photos on the news. Hawkins noticed her fear and subtly shifted his position, placing himself between his flock and the violent men who'd invaded their sanctuary. "The Lord's house is open to all," Hawkins continued, maintaining eye contact with Walker. "Though he asks that we leave our burdens and our weapons at the door." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Kane's hand twitched toward his concealed gun, but Walker held up a staying hand, intrigued by the preacher's boldness. "Weapons, Reverend." Walker's voice carried a hint of amusement. "What makes you think we're armed?" He moved closer to the pulpit, his stance threatening despite his casual tone. "We're just tired travelers, seeking God's guidance." Hawkins smiled gently, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had once lined up 1,000-yard shots, never left Walker's face. "The Lord knows what we carry, friend, both our visible burdens and those we think are hidden." The Martinez brothers exchanged glances, unsettled by something they couldn't quite name. This wasn't the fearful reaction they'd expected. The preacher's calm seemed to fill the chapel, making their tactical advantage feel somehow less certain. "Beautiful chapel you have here," Walker observed, running his hand along a pew. "Good sight lines, elevated position, sturdy walls, almost like it was built for defense." His implied threat hung in the air. "Would be a shame if anything happened to it." "The Lord protects his house," Hawkins replied, his voice carrying a weight that made even Kane pause. in ways we don't always understand. For just a moment, something flickered behind his gentle expression, a shadow of the man he'd once been, the legend known as Ghost Eye. Walker caught that flicker and felt the first stirring of doubt. Something about this mild-mannered preacher wasn't adding up, but he'd come too far to back down now. They needed this position, needed the tactical advantage the chapel offered. "Service is over," Walker announced to the terrified congregation. "But the good reverend and his chapel will be hosting us for a while." He turned to Hawkins, dropping all pretense. "Anyone tries to leave, anyone tries to call for help, we'll give them a lesson in faith they won't survive." Hawkins watched his flock file out under the escapees' armed guard, whispering prayers that masked his tactical assessment of each threat. Walker may have thought he was taking control of the chapel, but he'd just made a terrible mistake. He'd threatened the one thing Hawkins had sworn to protect at all costs. The sun set behind stained glass windows, casting long shadows across the chapel floor. 5 violent men thought they'd found perfect shelter in God's house. Instead, they'd walked into the domain of a man who'd once made violence into an art form before finding a higher purpose. The question wasn't whether Hawkins could stop them. It was whether he could do it without becoming the man he'd left behind. Night fell over Cedar Ridge as the situation at the chapel turned dire. Walker's men had transformed the holy space into an armed camp, positioning themselves at key points throughout the building. The Martinez brothers controlled the bell tower, their rifles trained on the police barricade forming at the edge of town. Cooper had turned the basement into a makeshift command center, while Kane secured the perimeter with military precision. "Your reputation for hospitality is appreciated, Reverend," Walker smiled, settling into Hawkins' office like he owned it. "Though we'll be needing more than just shelter." He spread a map across the desk, markers indicating escape routes through the mountains. "You're going to help us hold this position for the next 24 hours. Hawkins stood calmly, hands folded before him, watching Walker defile his sacred space. "And my congregation?" he asked, though his keen eye had already counted the hostages they'd kept. 12 souls, including young Tommy Parker and his mother, held in the main chapel under armed guard. "Insurance," Walker replied coldly. "Motivation for your continued cooperation." He leaned forward, studying the preacher's unchanging expression. "You're taking this rather well, Father. Most men of God I've known would be praying a lot louder right now." "The Lord's strength shows itself in many ways." Hawkins entered, his voice carrying that same steady calm that had begun to unnerve his captors. Even Kane, hardened by years of combat, found himself watching the preacher more carefully than their other hostages. The radio crackled, Sheriff Wilson's voice cutting through the tension. "Walker, we've got the building surrounded. Let the hostages go and we can talk terms." Walker laughed, grabbing the radio they'd taken from a deputy's car. "Terms? I've got 12 lives in here, Sheriff. You're not in a position to negotiate." As if to emphasize his point, Carlos Martinez fired a warning shot from the bell tower, sending the police scrambling for cover. The sound echoed through the chapel, making the hostages flinch, all except Hawkins, who didn't even blink. "Something odd about you, Reverend," Kane observed, moving closer. His military training screamed that they were missing something. "Where you stand, where you watch everything, almost like a man of peace," Hawkins finished for him. But there was something in his tone, a subtle warning that made Kane's combat instincts surge. Before he could pursue the thought, Walker cut in. "Enough. Here's what's going to happen," he addressed the hostages. "Anyone tries to play hero, anyone even thinks about signaling the cops, we start sending bodies out those pretty stained glass windows, starting with the boy." Tommy Parker whimpered, clutching his mother's hand. Hawkins felt something shift inside him, not the rage of his younger days, but something colder, more focused. The same clarity that had guided his shots across impossible distances. "The boy stays with me," Hawkins said quietly. It wasn't a request. For just a moment, his peaceful demeanor slipped, and Walker caught a glimpse of something in those pale, blue eyes that made him hesitate. It passed quickly, but it left questions hanging in the air. Cooper, watching from the shadows, sensed it too. "Boss, maybe we should—" Walker silenced him with a look. They were committed now. The chapel's position was perfect for their needs, and this mild-mannered preacher, whatever his mysteries, wasn't going to stop them. "You've got until dawn to consider your position, Reverend," Walker declared. "Either you help us maintain control. Here, use your influence to keep things calm, or we start showing everyone just how far from heaven this house of God really is." Outside, more police units arrived, their lights painting the stained glass in shifting patterns of red and blue. Inside, Hawkins watched his captors with the same patient attention he'd once used to study distant targets. They thought they were in control. They thought they were the wolves among sheep. They didn't realize they'd cornered themselves with a shepherd who'd once been deadlier than any wolf. "I'll pray for guidance," Hawkins told Walker, his words carrying a weight his captors couldn't quite understand. The time was coming when they'd learn why some legends are whispered about in fear, why some reputations outlive the men who earned them. But for now, like the sniper he'd once been, Ghost Eye would wait for the perfect moment to reveal his true nature. In the darkened chapel, as his captors patrolled the perimeter, Reverend Hawkins knelt before the altar in what appeared to be prayer. But behind his closed eyes, a war raged between the man of peace he'd become and the warrior he'd once been. 25 years of devotion to a peaceful path now collided with the cold certainty that violence might be the only way to save his flock. Through the stained glass, moonlight painted patterns across the floor where Tommy Parker slept fitfully beside his mother. The boy's presence was a constant reminder of what was at stake. In the bell tower, the Martinez brothers kept their vigil, their rifle barrels occasionally catching the light like serpents' teeth in the darkness. "Struggling with your conscience, Reverend?" Walker's voice cut through the silence. He'd been watching Hawkins, trying to decode the mystery behind the preacher's unsettling calm. "Must be difficult, all this violence in your sacred space." Hawkins opened his eyes, but didn't rise from his knees. "I struggle not with conscience, Mr. Walker, but with necessity." His words carried the weight of someone intimately familiar with such choices. "Sometimes the shepherd must decide how best to protect his flock." Cain, ever vigilant, picked up on something in the preacher's tone. "You talk like a soldier, not a priest." His hand rested instinctively on his weapon. "Like someone who's made those choices before." Memories flashed through Hawkins's mind. The weight of a rifle in his hands, the perfect stillness before a shot, the responsibility of holding lives in the space between heartbeats. He'd walked away from that life, found a higher calling. But had that calling brought him here for exactly this moment? "We all have choices to make," Hawkins replied, finally standing. His movement was fluid, economical, a detail not lost on Cain's trained eye. Even the good book speaks of times for peace and times for war. Cooper, who'd been monitoring police frequencies, approached with news. "They're bringing in federal response teams, 6 hours out at most." The tension in the chapel ratcheted higher. Walker's plan required 12 more hours before their extraction would be ready. Hawkins watched the subtle shift in their tactical positions, reading their movements like he once read wind patterns. The violence was coming, as inevitable as dawn. The only question was whether he could prevent it without becoming the man he'd spent 25 years trying to leave behind. "Tell me, Reverend," Walker pressed, circling closer, "what would Jesus do in your position? Turn the other cheek while we start making examples of your flock?" His threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Hawkins turned those pale blue eyes on Walker, and for just a moment the escaped convict felt like he was being sighted through a scope. Christ also drove the wicked from the temple, the preacher responded softly. The question isn't what he would do, but what he will guide me to do. In the shadows of his sacred space, Ghost Eye's legendary skills stirred like a sleeping giant. Every exit, every angle, every possibility had already been measured and memorized, the same attention to detail that had once made him death incarnate. Now served a higher purpose, finding a way to save lives rather than take them. You know what I see, Reverend? Kane interrupted, his special forces training screaming warnings he couldn't quite articulate. I see a man measuring distances, calculating angles, like someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about trajectories. Hawkins met his gaze steadily. The Lord's geometry is perfect, Mr. Kane. Every angle, every distance serves his purpose. It was the kind of answer that could mean everything or nothing, depending on what you knew to listen for. As midnight approached, Hawkins returned to his prayers. But these weren't the simple supplications of a peaceful preacher. They were the focused meditations of a man who'd once made death an art form, asking not for deliverance from violence, but for the wisdom to use it one last time in service of something greater than himself. The moon climbed higher, its light creating shadows that looked almost like crosshairs on the chapel floor. In a few hours, these men would force him to choose between his oath of peace and his duty to protect. The question wasn't whether Ghost Eye could stop them. It was whether Reverend Hawkins could live with becoming that man again. Sheriff Wilson stood at the police barricade, watching the chapel through his binoculars as federal tactical teams began to arrive. 23 years wearing the badge in Cedar Ridge, and he'd never felt more useless. But he knew something the Veds didn't, something that gave him both hope and fear for what was coming. Sheriff, Deputy Chen approached, her voice low. Feds want to take control of the operation, say they've got experience with these types. She paused, glancing at the chapel. They don't know about the Reverend, do they? Wilson lowered his binoculars, remembering the day 5 years ago when a military contact had warned him about who had really come to minister to his town. No, they don't, and right now, that might be our best advantage. Using the chaos of shift, change as cover, Wilson made his way to the chapel's old groundskeeper's shed. The Martinez brothers were good, but they had blind spots in their coverage. Blind spots Wilson suspected Hawkins had noticed hours ago. Inside the chapel, Walker's men had grown increasingly uneasy. They couldn't name what was wrong, but something about the preacher's calm had begun to feel less like peace and more like the stillness before a storm. Movement at the shed, Carlos Martinez called down. Single person, looks like the sheriff. Walker nodded to Kane, who slipped out to intercept. They couldn't risk losing their negotiating position. Kane found Wilson waiting calmly, hands visible. Bold move, Sheriff, the ex-soldier growled. Could have shot you. But you won't, Wilson replied, because I'm here to talk to the Reverend. And your boss is smart enough to want to know why I'd risk coming alone. 5 minutes later, Wilson stood before Hawkins in the chapel vestry, Kane watching from the doorway. The sheriff's eyes took in every detail, the way Hawkins stood, the subtle changes in the peaceful preacher's demeanor. It's time, isn't it? Wilson asked quietly. Time for Ghost Eye to come out of retirement. Kane's hand moved to his weapon, but Hawkins' voice stopped him. That name has no place in God's house, Sheriff. Yet something in his tone had changed, become harder, more focused. These men, Wilson pressed, they're not leaving without blood. You and I both know it. The feds are talking about rushing the building. It'll be a massacre. He stepped closer, voice dropping. I know what you can do, what you were. Hawkins turned to the stained glass window, sunlight catching his eyes in a way that made Kane think of scope lenses. I made a covenant with God, the preacher said softly, swore to walk a path of peace. And if that path leads through violence, Wilson challenged. If peace can only come after. Kane listened intently, pieces starting to fall into place. The way the preacher moved, the way he watched everything, it all suddenly made terrible sense. The federal response team leader, Wilson continued, he's young, aggressive, says he won't let another Waco happen, but we both know that's exactly what he'll cause if he goes in hard. Hawkins closed his eyes, and for a moment both men could see the weight of his decision. 25 years, he whispered. 25 years of choosing a different way. And maybe, Wilson suggested, God led you down that path knowing this. Day would come, knowing your skills would be needed to save lives, not take them. Kane backed away slowly, his military instincts screaming warnings. He needed to tell Walker, needed to make him understand what they were really dealing with, but Hawkins' voice stopped him. Mr. Kane, the preacher called softly, remember what I said about the Lord's geometry? There was something new in his tone, something that made Kane's combat-trained nerves go cold. Every angle serves his purpose. Wilson watched understanding dawn in Kane's eyes, the realization that they hadn't taken a chapel hostage. They'd walked into the killing ground of a legend who'd spent 25 years learning an even deadlier skill. Patience. Tell your men, Hawkins said to Kane's retreating form, they have one more chance to walk out of God's house in peace. His voice carried the same gentle tone he used in sermons, but now everyone could hear what lay beneath it, the cold precision of a man who had once made death an art form. Wilson left shortly after, hope and dread warring in his heart. He'd come seeking the legend known as Ghost Eye. He'd found something perhaps even more dangerous, a man of peace who remembered exactly how to wage war. Dawn approached Cedar Ridge, painting the chapel windows in shades of amber and gold. Hawkins moved among his captive congregation, offering quiet words of comfort that masked his true purpose. Every movement was a calculation, every gesture positioned another piece in a puzzle his captors couldn't see. Let me tend to my flock, he'd asked Walker. Let me bring them water, blankets. Show them God's mercy hasn't abandoned them. Walker had agreed, seeing only a pastor's concern. He didn't notice how each blanket Hawkins placed created subtle barriers, how each cluster of hostages was gradually shifted into protected positions. Keep an eye on him, Kane warned, his military instincts still screaming. But watching Hawkins move through his practiced routine of chapel maintenance only seemed to confirm his harmless appearance. The preacher lit candles, adjusted hymn books, straightened chairs, each action so natural, so expected. What they didn't see was how every candle doubled as a light barrier, how each repositioned piece of furniture created new cover positions. The old wooden panels he carefully cleaned would deflect bullets in exactly the right directions. Even his morning prayer path through the chapel was establishing sightlines, measuring distances. Brother Matthews, Hawkins spoke softly to an elderly deacon. Remember how we discussed renovating the ceiling? His words seemed innocent, but the old man's eyes widened slightly. They'd never discussed renovations. The support beams, particularly. Such faithful service they've given, holding everything up, like watching over sleeping angels. Kane frowned, noting how the preacher's path kept bringing him back to certain spots. But surely a man of God would naturally gravitate toward his altar, his pulpit, his stations of prayer. The ex-soldier's training nagged at him, trying to recognize a pattern he couldn't quite see. "The boy's scared, Reverend," Mrs. Parker whispered as Hawkins brought water. "Tommy hasn't slept." Hawkins knelt beside them, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearest hostages to hear. "Remember the story of Daniel in the lion's den?" he asked Tommy. "How faith protected him. Sometimes the Lord sends guardians we don't expect." His hands adjusted their blankets, ensuring they were behind the heaviest pews. Cooper, monitoring police frequencies, grew increasingly agitated. "Federal response team is pushing for action. Their profile suggests the preacher will break under pressure. Give them an opening." Walker watched Hawkins continue his methodical movements through the chapel. "Profile's wrong," he muttered. There's something else going on here. But even his criminal instincts couldn't decode the deadly geometry being drawn in sacred spaces. The Martinez brothers maintained their watch from the bell tower, professional enough to notice how the preacher's activities had subtly reduced their coverage. Chairs and banners now blocked certain angles, forcing them to focus on specific areas Hawkins had chosen. "Your preparations comfort them," Walker observed, gesturing to the calmer hostages. "Almost like you've handled crisis situations before." Hawkins smiled gently. "The Lord prepares us in ways we don't always understand." He adjusted a silver cross on the wall, angling it just so. In a few hours, it would reflect the rising sun directly into the bell tower's primary firing position. "Been watching you, Reverend," Kane approached quietly. "Where you move, where you arrange things. Almost like a man putting his house in order," Hawkins finished. "Everything in its proper place, according to his plan." His eyes met Kane's, and for just a moment, the soldier saw past the peaceful facade to something that made him step back. As morning light began to creep through the stained glass, Hawkins completed his preparations. To his captors, they saw a chapel arranged for prayer and comfort, but they'd unknowingly allowed him to transform his sacred space into something else. A carefully crafted kill box, designed by a man who'd once made an art form of impossible shots. The Lord's geometry, he'd called it. And soon they would learn why some legends are whispered about in fear, why some skills never fade, and why the deadliest predator is the one you never see coming. The moment came with the morning sun. Light streamed through the stained glass windows, and Walker's carefully laid plans began to unravel in ways he couldn't understand. It started with the Martinez brothers in the bell tower. Lost sight of. "The north approach," Carlos radioed down, frustration in his voice. "Some kind of reflection." The silver cross Hawkins had adjusted now caught the sunrise perfectly, creating a blinding spot in their coverage. But that was just the beginning. Kane watched the preacher lead morning prayers, something about the man's movements setting off every combat instinct he'd developed in special forces. Each hymn seemed to move the hostages slightly, shifting them away from predetermined firing positions. Even the way Hawkins walked between the pews appeared to block carefully planned fields of fire. "On your knees is a good position for you, Reverend," Walker sneered, trying to maintain control as his tactical advantage steadily eroded. "Maybe we should start making examples. Show everyone here what happens to those who don't pray hard enough." Hawkins rose slowly, and something in his movement made every combat veteran in the room tense. It wasn't the motion of a man afraid, but the smooth economy of a predator uncoiling. "The Lord teaches us that pride comes before a fall, Mr. Walker. Sometimes literally." As if on cue, the ancient floorboard beneath Miguel Martinez's position in the bell tower, the one Hawkins had carefully cleaned earlier, gave way with a crack. The cartel killer's curses echoed through the chapel as he caught himself, his rifle clattering to the level below. "Blessed are the peacekeepers," Hawkins intoned, his voice carrying that same gentle strength. But now, everyone in the chapel could hear what Kane had been sensing, the steel beneath the silk, the wolf hiding in shepherd's clothing. Cooper, still monitoring police frequencies, caught fragments of confusion in their communications. Somehow, their thermal imaging was being disrupted, their surveillance positions compromised by inexplicable building angles they'd sworn weren't there before. "Getting weird readings," he reported to Walker. "Like the chapel's architecture itself is working against us." His eyes narrowed at Hawkins. "Almost like someone who knows about tactical positioning designed it that way." Walker grabbed the preacher's collar, his control slipping. "What are you? What is this?" But even as he did, he realized his mistake. The movement had put him directly in the shaft of light from the rose window, exactly where Hawkins had been subtly maneuvering him for the last hour. "Amazing, isn't it?" Hawkins replied calmly, despite the grip on his clothes. "How the Lord's light can blind those who aren't prepared for it." Walker cursed, his vision filled with spots, forced to release his hold. Kane watched all this with growing dread. In the military, he'd learned to recognize when he was being maneuvered into a trap. Everything about this felt like an operation being run by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Each problem they faced seemed random, but was hitting them precisely where it hurt their tactical position most. "Boss," he called to Walker, "we need to talk about what the sheriff said, about who this man might really be." But before he could continue, a new hymn began. Hawkins' deep voice led his congregation in "Amazing Grace," the sound filling the chapel with its ancient promise of redemption. Yet beneath the words of salvation, his captors could hear something else. A countdown beginning, a trigger being slowly squeezed. "You're running out of time, Mr. Walker," Hawkins said during a pause in the verse. "The Lord's patience is endless, but mine has limits. Release my flock, walk away, and we'll call it a lesson learned." The morning sun continued its arc, shifting the shadows in the chapel according to angles Hawkins had memorized decades ago. With each passing minute, his captors' tactical position deteriorated further, though they couldn't quite understand how or why. They'd come expecting to control a simple preacher and his congregation. Instead, they were being systematically dismantled by a man who turned his entire chapel into a weapon. It happened during what seemed like a simple act of mercy. One of Walker's men had gotten rough with Mrs. Thompson, and Hawkins had moved to steady her fall. His movement was fluid, precise, too precise. Kane watched as the preacher's hand shot out, catching the elderly woman before she hit the ground, while simultaneously shifting her away from danger. "Former combat medic, Reverend?" Kane asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "That catch, that's not something they teach in seminary." Hawkins helped Mrs. Thompson back to her seat, every motion measured and calm. "The Lord guides our hands in times of need, Mr. Kane, sometimes in ways that surprise even us." But Kane wasn't buying the peaceful preacher act anymore. He'd seen enough. That was a combat catch and roll. Special Forces technique, modified for civilian protection. His hand moved toward his weapon. "Who are you, really?" The chapel fell silent. Even Walker stopped his pacing to study their supposed hostage more carefully. Hawkins stood in a shaft of morning light, his presence somehow filling the space in a way it hadn't before. "Tell me something, Mr. Kane," Hawkins replied, his voice carrying to every corner of the chapel. "In all your military training, did they teach you about wind vectors in enclosed spaces, about how sound bounces off stone walls, about the way light and shadow can blind a shooter at exactly the wrong moment?" Carlos Martinez's voice crackled over the radio from the bell tower. "Boss, something's wrong up here. All our pre-planned firing positions, they're compromised. Like someone knew exactly where we'd set up." Walker's face darkened. "What did you do?" "I prepared my house for visitors," Hawkins answered simply. But now everyone could hear the double meaning in his words. His eyes, those pale blue eyes, that had once guided impossible shots, swept the chapel. "Did you notice that every third pew is anchored differently, that the old wood has different densities, that sound carries differently near the altar?" Cooper, monitoring their security, feed suddenly cursed. "Boss, our camera coverage, there are blind spots everywhere, like the whole building was designed to—" He trailed off, realization dawning. "To what?" Walker demanded. "To be a shooter's paradise," Kane finished quietly. "Every angle, every shadow, every reflection, it's all positioned perfectly, like someone who really understands ballistics helped restore this place." Hawkins continued his calm walk through the chapel, but now everyone saw his movements differently. The way he always knew exactly where everyone was, the way he positioned himself in relation to threats, the way his eyes constantly tracked and measured. "Last chance," Hawkins offered, his tone still gentle, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "The Lord offers forgiveness to those who seek. Walk out now, face earthly justice, find heavenly mercy." Walker, desperate to regain control, grabbed young Tommy Parker, pressing a gun to the boy's head. "Enough games, Reverend, or whatever you are. You're going to—" The words died in his throat as Hawkins turned to face him. Something had changed in the preacher's stance, a subtle shift that every combat veteran in the room recognized. The shepherd had dropped his disguise, and suddenly they were all staring into the eyes of a wolf. "That weapon you're holding," Hawkins said softly, "has a manufacturing defect. Common in that model. The firing pin catches if you angle it past 30 degrees. His eyes flicked to the gun, then back to Walker's face. "Which you just did." Walker's face went pale as he realized the preacher was right. His weapon had jammed the instant he'd raised it. But how could Hawkins have known? "Boss," Kane's voice shook slightly, "remember those stories about a cavalry marksman? The one they called Ghost Eye? The one who could read a weapon's flaws from across a battlefield?" In the growing light of morning, Reverend Thomas Hawkins stood among his flock, no longer hiding what he was. And for the first time, his captors understood the true meaning of fear. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the chapel windows as Reverend Hawkins stood before his captors, his peaceful demeanor masking the deadly calculation behind his eyes. The time for subtlety had passed. Now he would give them one final chance to understand exactly what they were facing. "Let me tell you a story," Hawkins began, his voice carrying the same tone he used for sermons, "about a cavalry marksman who could read the wind so well they said he could curve bullets around corners. A man who made shots that physics said were impossible." Kane's hand tightened on his weapon. He knew this story. Every Special Forces operator had heard the legend of Ghost Eye. They said he could see the flaws in a man's stance before he took the shot. Hawkins continued. "Could read distance and trajectory, like most men read morning papers. But what made him truly dangerous wasn't his aim. It was his patience." Walker tried to interrupt, but Hawkins raised his hand in a gesture so commanding that the hardened criminal fell silent. "The most famous story," the preacher went on, moving slowly through his chapel, "was about a hostage situation in Kandahar. 6 gunmen, 12 hostages, impossible angles. They said Ghost Eye waited 18 hours without moving, without sleeping, until all 6 targets aligned for a single shot that ricocheted 5 times. Carlos Martinez's voice crackled over the radio. "Boss, he's been moving us all day. Every time he rearranged something in the chapel, every time he shifted position, he's been herding us exactly where he wants us." "You're trying to scare us, Reverend," Walker snarled, but his voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. "Ghost Eye vanished years ago. Some say he died. Others say he found God," Hawkins replied softly, "traded his scope for scripture, seeking redemption for the lives he'd taken by saving souls instead." His eyes met Walker's. "But sometimes the shepherd must protect his flock by any means necessary." Cooper, who'd been studying their tactical positioning with growing horror, suddenly realized what had been done to them. "Every move we made, every position we took, he's been setting us up since the beginning. The whole chapel's become a killing house," Kane finished, cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "We're standing exactly where he wants us, covering exactly the angles he chose." Hawkins nodded slowly. "In my years of service, I learned that the most dangerous weapon isn't a rifle or a scope. It's understanding wind and weather, distance and deflection, human nature and habit, understanding that the best trap is the one your target walks into willingly." The dying sunlight caught his eyes, and for a moment they seemed to reflect like scope lenses. "I'm giving you this warning not out of fear, but out of duty. The Lord commands us to offer mercy before judgment." Walker, desperate to regain control, raised his weapon. "You're just one man, A washed-up legend hiding behind a collar. No, Hawkins corrected gently. I'm a servant of God who never forgot. His training, a shepherd who knows exactly how to deal with wolves. He looked around at his captive congregation, positioned exactly where he'd gradually moved them throughout the day, all in protected positions, all clear of his pre-planned firing lines. You have exactly 1 hour to surrender, he announced, his voice carrying that same peaceful tone that now seemed far more terrifying than any threat. After that, I stop being a preacher, trying to save your souls, and become something else entirely. Something you've only heard whispered about around campfires and barracks. The sun sank lower, creating the exact light conditions he'd been waiting for. Soon, the chapel's architecture itself would become a weapon in the hands of a man who'd turned violence into an art form before finding a higher calling. The choice is yours, Hawkins concluded. Surrender and face earthly justice, or discover why some legends are whispered in fear. Either way, my flock leaves this chapel unharmed. The only question is whether you leave in cuffs or consecrated ground. The revelation came from the most unexpected source. Cooper, still monitoring police frequencies, suddenly went pale as he listened to his earpiece. His hand shook as he turned to Walker, his voice barely a whisper. Boss, we got it all wrong. All of it. The Federal Response Team's radio chatter had triggered something in their database. Files were being opened, classified records unsealed. The legend of Ghost Eye wasn't just a story, it was a carefully buried military secret. He wasn't just a marksman, Cooper continued, each word landing like a hammer blow. He was the marksman, the one they called in when they needed the impossible, the shots everyone else said couldn't be made. Kane moved closer, his military training screaming warnings. What are you talking about? Kandahar wasn't just one shot. That ricocheted 5 times, Cooper read from his screen. He orchestrated the entire architecture of the situation, spent 3 days ahead of time, adjusting windows, moving furniture, calculating angles. By the time he took the shot, the whole building had become part of his weapon. Walker looked around the chapel with new eyes, suddenly understanding. Every move Hawkins had made since they arrived, adjusting candles, moving furniture, shifting impositions, had been reconstructing his masterpiece. The record shows 27 confirmed impossible shots, Cooper went on, his voice shaking. But those were just the ones they couldn't keep classified. The real number. He stopped, swallowing hard. They called him Ghost Eye, not because he was hard to spot, but because he could see what no one else could. Wind patterns, stress points, ricochet angles. He could read a building's skeleton like other men read maps. Hawkins stood calmly at his pulpit, no longer bothering to hide the predator's grace in his movements. I spent 15 years testing the limits of what was possible with a rifle, he said quietly. Then I spent 25 years turning this chapel into something beyond possibility. The Martinez brothers radioed down from their position, panic in their voices. Every window, every corner, they're all lined up. The whole building's a giant calculation. We're not in a church, we're inside the scope of his rifle. Kane's Special Forces training finally put the pieces together. You didn't just retire to become a preacher, he realized. You spent 25 years building the perfect shooting gallery. This whole chapel, it's your masterpiece. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Hawkins replied, his voice still carrying that gentle tone that now seemed absolutely terrifying. He led me here for a purpose. Every renovation, every repair, all part of his plan. And yours. Walker's face contorted, with rage and fear. You're lying. This is just a mind game. No one could plan something that long in advance. 27 confirmed impossible shots, Hawkins corrected softly. Because I could see what others couldn't. Could read the mathematics of violence. In the spaces between moments. His eyes, those pale blue mirrors that had seen so much death, swept the chapel. But this is my finest work. A symphony of angles and trajectories perfected over 25 years of patient preparation. The setting sun painted the chapel in blood-red light, and suddenly they all saw it. Every beam, every column, every piece of aged wood and ancient stone had been positioned exactly where it needed to be. The entire building had become a massive compound calculation, a three-dimensional targeting solution waiting to be solved. "In 30 minutes, Hawkins announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, the sun will reach an angle I've waited 25 years to use. The light will strike the rose window exactly as I designed it, and in that moment, this house of God will become what I spent my entire military career preparing for. The most sophisticated firing solution ever created." The true horror of their situation finally dawned on them. They hadn't taken a preacher hostage in a chapel. They'd walked into a weapon 25 years in the making, crafted by a legend who'd turned death into mathematics and architecture into ammunition. Desperation has a scent all its own. It filled the chapel as Walker's men realized they were trapped inside a weapon decades in the making. Each passing minute brought them closer to the moment Hawkins had spent 25 years calculating. "We need to move," Kane urged, his combat instincts screaming. "Change positions, disrupt his calculations." But even as he spoke, he knew it was useless. Every possible position in the chapel had been accounted for, every angle measured and mapped over years of patient preparation. "Nobody's that good," Walker snarled, but his voice shook. "Nobody can plan something this complex." He turned to Cooper, who was still going through the classified files. "There has to be a weakness, a flaw in his setup." Cooper's face had gone ashen. "There's a report here, classified above top secret. Operation Desert Phantom. He didn't just make impossible shots. He redesigned entire buildings to make them possible. They'd send him in months ahead to prepare sites, turning architecture itself into a weapon." The Martinez brothers tried to shift their position in the bell tower, only to find that every new angle exposed them to worse possibilities. "It's like the whole building is alive," Carlos radioed, panic creeping into his voice. "Every move we make just puts us deeper into his kill zone." 20 minutes. Hawkins announced calmly, watching the sun's progression through his carefully arranged windows. 20 minutes until everything I've prepared for comes together." He turned those pale blue eyes on Walker. "Time enough for salvation, if you choose it." Walker's response was to grab Mrs. Thompson, pressing his gun to her head. "You can't shoot without hitting her. Even you can't make that shot." A small smile touched Hawkins' lips, not one of joy but of sad certainty. "Second pew from the left, Mr. Walker. The wood there is older, denser. Bullets react differently. The grain patterns create a natural curve in the trajectory, especially when combined with the air current from the ventilation system I installed in 2005. Kane felt his blood run cold. Even the environment itself had been engineered, down to the air currents. They weren't just trapped in a building. They were standing inside the most sophisticated weapon ever created. 15 minutes, Hawkins continued. The sun will strike. The rose window, at precisely the angle I calculated when I restored it 12 years ago. The light diffraction will create a momentary blindness in specific positions you're all standing in by design. The revelation of their complete manipulation hit them all. Every move they'd made since entering the chapel had been predicted, planned for, and guided by subtle cues they hadn't even noticed. The gentle preacher hadn't just prepared for this moment. He'd orchestrated their entire encounter like a grandmaster setting up a chess game. "You're not just Ghost Eye," Kane realized, horror dawning in his voice. "The legends got it wrong. They thought you were a shooter who could see impossible shots, but you're something else entirely. You're an artist who turns physics itself Into a weapon. Hawkins nodded slowly. The Lord grants different gifts to different people, Mr. Kane. Mine was seeing the mathematics in moments, the geometry in violence. I turned away from that gift, sought peace instead. His eyes hardened. But you brought war to my house of peace, and now you'll understand why some legends are whispered in fear. Walker, his control completely shattered, began firing wildly. At the walls, the windows, trying to disrupt the careful calculations built into the chapel's very bones. But each bullet found only the paths Hawkins had designed decades ago, ricocheting harmlessly away from the hostages. 10 minutes, Hawkins announced, his voice still carrying that same gentle tone that now sounded like a death knell. Time enough. For one last prayer. Choose wisely, gentlemen. Surrender or salvation. Those are the only options left. The sun continued its inexorable descent toward the moment Hawkins had spent half a lifetime preparing for, and in its dying light, 5 violent men finally understood the true meaning of divine intervention. With just minutes remaining before his carefully calculated moment, Reverend Thomas Hawkins stood at his pulpit one last time. The setting sun painted his face in amber light as he looked out over his congregation. Hostages and captors alike, all part of this final service. Today's sermon, he began, his voice carrying that same gentle power that had guided his flock for 25 years, is about choices, about moments that define us, about the thin line between mercy and justice. Walker's men shifted uneasily, their weapons suddenly feeling inadequate against the architectural weapon they stood within. Even Kane, with all his special forces training, couldn't stop his hands from shaking. In Exodus, Hawkins continued, moving with deliberate grace through his chapel, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, leading him to a moment of inevitable judgment. Just as your hearts have been hardened, leading you here, to this precise moment in this precise place. Cooper's radio crackled with increasingly frantic messages from the federal response team outside. They were picking up strange readings, impossible patterns in their thermal imaging. The whole building seemed to be changing as the sun descended. 7 minutes, Hawkins announced, his eyes tracking the light's progression across his carefully arranged sanctuary. 7 minutes until this house of God reveals its final purpose. The mathematics of redemption are precise, gentlemen, as exact as the trajectories I once calculated across battlefields. The Martinez brothers tried one last time to adjust their position in the bell tower, only to find themselves channeled exactly where Hawkins wanted them. Every move they made seemed to flow along paths he'd carved into the chapel's architecture over decades. You see, he continued, his voice still carrying that pastoral calm, I spent 15 years learning how to take life with mathematical precision. Then I spent 25 years learning how to save it the same way. This chapel isn't just a house of worship, it's a testament to both of those lessons. Kane watched in growing horror as the preacher's movement subtly adjusted the last elements of his grand design. Each gesture, each step, was part of a calculation, 25 years in the making. The Lord's geometry is perfect, Hawkins explained, reaching out to align a silver cross with microscopic precision. Every angle serves his purpose, every trajectory follows his plan. In 5 minutes, all of those divine calculations will reach their conclusion. Walker, his control completely shattered, fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The bullet ricocheted exactly as Hawkins had designed, following a path laid out years ago before embedding harmlessly in a reinforced beam. Even your violence serves his purpose, the preacher observed quietly. Every shot you fire, every move you make, follows patterns I spent decades perfecting. This isn't just architecture, gentlemen. This is mathematics given form, physics transformed into prayer. The sun touched the horizon, and the chapel's shadows began their final dance. Light refracted through windows placed with surgical precision, creating patterns that would soon align into the most sophisticated firing solution ever conceived. 3 minutes, Hawkins announced, taking his position at the pulpit. Time for one last choice, one final opportunity to choose grace over judgment. Because when these shadows align, when these angles converge, this house of God will become something else entirely. A weapon crafted by a man who turned violence into art before finding peace. His eyes, those pale blue mirrors that had once guided impossible shots, swept over his captors one last time. The Lord offers mercy to those who seek it, but he also promises justice to those who reject it. Which will you choose, gentlemen? Surrender or salvation? The mathematics of this moment allow for no other outcomes. The sun sank lower, and in its dying light, 5 violent men faced the final countdown to a judgment 25 years in the making. 1 minute remained. The chapel air grew thick with tension as Hawkins's decades-long calculation approached its culmination. Every shadow, every reflection, every carefully engineered angle was about to align into something the world had never seen. 30 seconds, Hawkins announced quietly. Look at your positions, gentlemen. Notice how the light falls just so, how the shadows guide you exactly where I planned all those years ago. His voice carried no triumph, only a deep sadness at what was to come. Cain made one last desperate attempt to understand. You didn't just prepare for a hostage situation. You built this whole place as one massive firing solution. Every renovation, every repair was another calculation added to the equation. Hawkins finished. The new support beam in O2, positioned to create that specific ricochet angle. The stained glass restored in O7, crafted to refract light in precise patterns. Even the hymn books, their leather bindings chosen for how they'd affect sound waves. Walker, his control completely broken, started laughing hysterically. You're insane! Nobody plans something this complex. Nobody waits 25 years for a single moment. Ghost. I does, Cooper whispered, still monitoring police frequencies. The files. They called him the architect of death before he disappeared, said he could turn buildings into bullets. The Martinez brothers radioed down one last time from their position in the bell tower. Boss, the angles, they're all moving. The whole building's shifting with the light. We're not just in his kill box. We're part of his weapon. 15 seconds, Hawkins continued, moving to his final position. Each step had been practiced thousands of times over 25 years, each movement part of a grand mathematical equation about to be solved. Outside, the Federal Response Team's instruments were going haywire. Every calculation they tried to make about the building's layout seemed to shift and change, as if the chapel itself was coming alive with deadly purpose. 10 seconds, Hawkins intoned. The Lord's geometry is about to reveal itself. Every angle, every shadow, every reflection, all part of his divine calculation. Cain watched in horrified fascination as the dying sunlight began its final transformation. Beams of light struck precisely placed mirrors and metal surfaces, creating a complex web of illumination that had taken decades to perfect. 5 seconds, Hawkins announced. One last chance for surrender. One final opportunity to choose peace over judgment. Walker raised his weapon, but his hands shook so badly he could barely aim. You're just one man. You can't possibly... I'm not just one man, Hawkins corrected gently. I'm 25 years of patience. I'm 15 years of impossible shots made real. I'm the living calculation of violence turned to righteous purpose. The sun touched the exact point Hawkins had spent half a lifetime waiting for. In that moment, every shadow in the chapel aligned, every carefully engineered angle converged, and 5 violent men realized they were standing inside something unprecedented in human history. A weapon that had taken 25 years to fire. Time's up, Hawkins said softly. May God have mercy on your souls. The chapel held its breath, waiting for the mathematics of redemption to play out in blood and justice. The moment of convergence arrived with the precision of divine mathematics. As the sun struck the rose window at exactly the angle Hawkins had calculated 25 years ago, the chapel transformed from a house of worship into the most sophisticated weapon ever created. The first shot came from nowhere and everywhere. A single beam of light, refracted through carefully placed prisms, momentarily blinded the Martinez brothers in the bell tower. In that precise second, a ricochet pattern Hawkins had designed into the bell's architecture disarmed them both with a single bullet that seemed to bend around corners. Impossible, Kane breathed, watching physics itself bow to Hawkins's will. But the legend of Ghost Eye was only beginning to reveal itself. Walker fired wildly, but each bullet followed paths Hawkins had carved into the chapel's very bones decades ago. Every shot was guided by precise calculations, channeled through specialized wood grains and metal fixtures, harmlessly away from the hostages and into capture points designed for exactly this moment. "The Lord's geometry is perfect," Hawkins announced calmly, his movements flowing like water through the chaos. Each step triggered another carefully planned sequence. Light reflected off the silver cross he'd positioned earlier, creating a blinding pattern that herded the criminals exactly where he wanted them. Cooper, scrambling to maintain their tactical position, found himself guided by subtle architectural cues into a corner where the aged wood panels, specially treated and aligned over decades, created a natural containment barrier. One shot from Hawkins, and the panels splintered in a calculated pattern, pinning him without injury. "You don't just see angles," Kane realized, his special forces training finally understanding what they were witnessing. "You see time itself. Every moment, every movement. You calculated all of this years ago." The Martinez brothers tried to reposition, but the bell tower's acoustics, perfected through years of subtle adjustments, created a disorienting sound pattern that Hawkins had designed specifically for this scenario. Two more shots, bouncing off precisely angled surfaces, and they were disarmed and contained. Walker, his control completely shattered, made one last desperate move toward Tommy Parker. But Hawkins had prepared for this exact moment. A sequence of shots fired with mathematical precision ricocheted off carefully placed metallic surfaces throughout the chapel. Each bullet followed a path laid out decades ago, systematically cutting off every escape route. "The mathematics of redemption," Hawkins explained, his voice still carrying that gentle pastoral tone, "require precision. Each angle calculated to stop violence without taking life. Every trajectory designed to disarm without destroying." The final confrontation came as the sun aligned with the last of Hawkins' carefully placed reflective surfaces. Walker found himself standing in a crossfire grid 25 years in the making. Every possible movement, every potential action had been accounted for in Hawkins' grand calculation. "It's done," Hawkins announced quietly. The chapel had become his masterpiece, a symphony of angles and trajectories that had systematically disarmed and contained 5 dangerous men without taking a single life. As the federal response team finally breached the chapel doors, they found a scene that would become legend. 5 of the most dangerous criminals in the country, each precisely incapacitated by shots that seemed to defy physics itself. The hostages, all unharmed, protected by architectural angles designed decades ago for exactly this purpose. And in the center of it all stood Reverend Thomas Hawkins, the legend known as Ghost Eye, who had turned God's house into a weapon of righteous precision. A man who had spent 25 years preparing for a moment of violence, only to use it to preserve life, instead of take it. "Your shots," Kane said in awe, as federal agents secured him. "They weren't just impossible, they were divine geometry." Hawkins finished softly. "The Lord's mathematics, applied to protect rather than destroy. My final gift to him, using the art of violence to serve the cause of peace." Sunday morning returned to Cedar Ridge, and with it came the sound of chapel bells ringing across the valley. 1 week had passed since the siege, but the story of what happened in that sacred space had already become legend. Federal agents still walked the chapel grounds, studying angles that seemed to defy physics, trying to understand how one man had turned architecture itself into an instrument of divine justice. Reverend Thomas Hawkins stood at his pulpit, surveying his congregation, with those pale blue eyes that now held no more secrets. The morning light streamed through the same windows he'd spent decades positioning, but today they cast only peace instead of precision. "Today's sermon," he began, his voice carrying that familiar gentle strength, "is about transformation, about how the Lord can take our darkest skills and turn them to light." His gaze met Cain's, who sat in the back pew, no longer a prisoner, but a man seeking understanding. The former Special Forces operator had requested to stay, to understand the man who had outcalculated every tactical advantage with decades of patient preparation. He wasn't alone. Every day, military strategists and federal agents came to study what they now called the miracle at Cedar Ridge. But they missed the true miracle. They saw only the mathematics, the incredible precision, the architectural genius that had turned a chapel into the most sophisticated weapon ever conceived. What they couldn't see was how a man dedicated to death had transformed himself into a guardian of life. Young Tommy Parker sat with his mother in the front pew, looking at his preacher with new eyes. But they weren't filled with fear of the legend he'd become. Instead, they saw what Hawkins had always been, a shepherd willing to do whatever was necessary to protect his flock. "The Lord's geometry," Hawkins concluded his sermon, "isn't just about angles and trajectories. It's about the divine mathematics of redemption, about how every shot that didn't take life became a testament to grace." The chapel remained his masterpiece, but now it stood as something more, a monument to the precision of mercy, where violence had been transformed into protection through 25 years of patient calculation. As the congregation filed out, Sheriff Wilson approached the pulpit. "The legend of Ghost Eye's growing, Reverend. They're already calling this the most sophisticated defensive operation in history." Hawkins smiled gently, straightening his Bible. "Then let them learn the right lesson from it, that the deadliest force isn't the ability to take life, it's the patience to preserve it." The morning sun painted the chapel in glory, its light catching the silver cross that had helped orchestrate salvation instead of destruction. In the end, the legend of Ghost Eye hadn't ended in Cedar Ridge. It had been reborn, transformed, from a story of death to a testament of divine protection. And in his chapel, surrounded by the geometry of grace he'd spent 25 years perfecting, Reverend Thomas Hawkins continued his true mission, not just saving souls, but protecting them with the same precision he'd once used to end them.